Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we are neutrally breaking down the specific policy positions, data points, and political criticisms laid out by One Nation leader Pauline Hanson in her recent AM Agenda interview. Whether you follow the daily back and forth of Canberra religiously, or you just want a clear picture of the core arguments shaping Australia's political landscape right now, we're going to skip the spin and look strictly at the numbers and the narratives presented in this source material. From local housing all the way to global technology, we're going to map out exactly what was said. All right, let's run through today's roadmap. We are covering political scandals and standards, housing and tax reforms, the mass migration debate, navigating the AI revolution, and finally, state GST and productivity. Starting with Section 1, Political Scandals and Standards, where the interview really zeroed in on the rules around public declarations. So right off the bat, Hanson fiercely criticizes Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. The issue? A gift of Japanese melons from the Japanese Prime Minister that actually weren't declared on Albanese's pecuniary interest register. You know, the official ledger for political gifts. Hanson doesn't hold back here. She frames this as a severe breach of public trust, demanding an open apology and essentially accusing the Prime Minister of deceiving the Australian public over exactly how many of these melons he received and consumed. Now, why bring up the melons? Well, Hanson is using this to highlight what she sees as a glaring double standard in the media. The interviewer actually points out that Albanese didn't declare them because they fell below the $700 threshold required for that public registry. But in response, Hanson compares this level of scrutiny, or in her view, the lack thereof, to the absolute firestorm she faced for not declaring a bulldozer, which is a valuation she notes is still pending anyway. She's arguing that, quite simply, there's one rule for the Prime Minister and a totally different rule for her. Moving into Section 2, Housing and Tax Reforms. This is where we pivot from personal conduct to national economic policy. The conversation shifts to some recent comments by the Prime Minister, where he described negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts as taxpayer-funded landlord welfare. Hanson fundamentally, absolutely disagrees with this framing. She argues that without these property investors, everyday families are the ones who suffer. She shares these anecdotes about young people wanting to buy homes close to where they grew up, close to their families, but just getting completely priced out of their local areas. Her core argument is that if you push investors out of the market, you're removing vital rental stock when people need it most. So what's her actual fix? It's a very specific, multi-pronged solution. Interestingly, she's not calling for a total free-for-all, but she doesn't want a total ban either. Her proposal is to cap negative gearing at a strict limit of 2 properties. She points out that realistically, 70 to 80% of people only ever own one home anyway. At the same time, she wants to reverse changes to the capital gains tax discount. Why? To make sure business owners and investors who put in long hours aren't given away entirely. Without them, she asserts, young renters would literally have nowhere to go. That brings us to Section 3, the mass migration debate. This is a massive cornerstone of Hanson's platform. The numerical contrast here is pretty staggering. Hanson is proposing a highly strict cap of 130,000 permanent migrants annually. She argues this cap is absolutely crucial to relieve the immense, crushing pressure on domestic infrastructure. We're talking overflowing schools, impossibly long waits to see a local doctor, and of course the housing shortage we just discussed. She directly challenges the current government's intake, citing it at over 500,000 net migration, claiming they've brought in 1.5 million people this term with plans for 1 million more. In her view, this sheer volume is actively hurting the everyday Australian standard of living. But she points out it's actually not just about the total volume, it's about the makeup of who is arriving. Hanson claims that out of 739,000 people the government recently brought in, only 51,605 were actually skilled workers. And even wilder, she notes only 1,800 entered the highly strained construction industry. She argues that bringing in unqualified migrants, she famously drops a line about YouTube-trained carpet layers who don't meet Australian standards, is deeply, deeply damaging to the domestic economy. Now, the interviewer logically asks the million-dollar question. If you cut migration that drastically, how on earth do small businesses survive the loss of labor? Hanson points to existing short-term visa categories, specifically backpackers and palm workers, which is the Pacific Australia Labor Mobility Scheme. She sees these as temporary stopgaps to keep businesses humming along. But her long-term vision? It's entirely domestic. She wants a heavy push to rebuild TAFE colleges and apprenticeship schemes, basically giving Australians the chance to skill up rather than endlessly relying on overseas labor. Shifting gears completely, Section 4, Navigating the AI Revolution and the Massive Resources It Demands. AI data hubs require a mind-boggling amount of power and water to run. Hanson uses this to directly attack Energy Minister Chris Bowen's plan to power these massive AI centers using renewable energy. She basically calls the idea foolish, given the intense, constant energy draw AI requires. Instead, she argues Australia has to look at small nuclear reactors to power this technological leap. She points out that, well, this is exactly what other countries around the world are already doing to meet the heavy energy demands of AI. And beyond just powering the grid, there's the critical issue of data sovereignty. Hanson stresses that we absolutely must build these data centers domestically, on Australian soil. The ultimate goal? Ensuring Australian data doesn't end up being controlled by China or America. It's a fair question. Who really holds your personal data? At the same time, she acknowledges the very real anxiety out there about AI taking jobs. She believes the government has to step in and regulate AI to some extent, making sure that as the nation progresses technologically, everyday Australian workers aren't just made suddenly obsolete. Finally, Section 5, State, GST, and Productivity, touching on the upcoming Productivity Commission report. Let's talk about the money. Hanson breaks states down into what she calls producing states versus lagging states. She points out that producing states like Western Australia and Queensland, which encourage mining and pro-business policies, are only getting about 70 to 75 cents back on every GST dollar they generate, or in Queensland's case, barely breaking even. Meanwhile, the lagging states like Victoria, Tasmania, and South Australia, they're getting back roughly $4 to $5. She argues it's completely unfair for WA to subsidize Victoria when Victoria has actively shut down its gas and manufacturing industries. She even cites a fertilizer plant that fled to New Zealand. Or Tasmania, which shut down its timber industry. Her message to those lagging states is pretty blunt. Get your productivity up, use your own resources, and stop relying on everyone else to prop you up. And that brings us to the end of our explainer. We've mapped out Pauline Hanson's entire policy roadmap from this interview, and it's clearly a highly localized, domestic-first approach. We're talking capping migration to protect local infrastructure, demanding states produce their own wealth, and building nuclear-powered data centers on home soil. But we have to ask the central question underlying all of this. Can these strict caps and state mandates truly balance national economic growth with the everyday Australian standard of living? Or do they risk stifling the very productivity they're aiming to protect? It's an incredibly complex balancing act, and one that is guaranteed to keep dominating the political agenda. Thanks so much for joining us to unpack the source material today.